Then, when that was dry, I switched to a smaller brush again to add more fur detail. Painting fur realistically takes time, but it can be so blissful to get into the flow state and work on it. Hi, I'm Anna Mason. Welcome to Nature Studio TV, here to help you become the artist you want to be. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I painted this pretty spaniel dog who looks a little bit like my own dog Honey. I worked from a good quality photograph and began with a pencil drawing where I marked in lines to show the edges of darker shapes within the fur, including a rough and textured edge to the outline of the head itself. I included plenty of detail to the eyes and nose, outlining all the shapes of colour within them to serve as a map for where to place my paint. Next, I applied masking fluid in lines using a fine line applicator to the whiskers, which were light in colour, and I knew were going to be fiddly to work around. The first stage of painting the furry effects was to use my size 5 brush to apply a pale layer of paint to all the different colour areas within the picture. I began with the pale cream colour, which was a very watery mix of some yellow ochre and Payne's grey. The aim with this stage is to match to the lightest possible version of the colour within each area. I then moved on to the more yellow-brown areas, adding yellow to yellow ochre but keeping it pale. To capture the fur texture, the key is to work with brush strokes that match the length and angles of the fur itself, and to layer to build the texture. So even at this stage, I applied in the direction of the fur, really tuning into looking for this in the photo. The next colour was a more orangey brown, and for that I added Payne's grey and Opera rose into the yellow ochre to keep the colour feeling bright. Next I applied a dark or more black brown around the eyes, nose and a few of the places most in shadow. I added more brown to the mix for the slightly lighter but still dark brown areas and painted those in now all over the dog. Although most of these areas would end up being dark and so much more, I kept watery with my mix for this so that I could add further layers to achieve more furry texture. Again, I paid close attention to the length and the direction of the fur and matched it with my brush strokes. Already with these different tones or values in place, the dog starts to come to life. To really bring her to life, I painted her eyes next, which I'll cover in detail in another video. And I then went on to paint the other darkest part of the painting, the nose. It was a lot of fun to get the texture right here, which again I'm going to cover in detail in another video. With the dark eyes and nose painted, the dog felt really alive, but for the painting to be successful, the fur has to look right. The next step was to darken up the darkest areas of fur, which I'd already mapped out, using my medium brush and a thick dark brown mix to apply into these areas, always seeking to match the length and angle of the fur with my brush, and watering the mix down a touch where the lighter tone was needed. Next, I used a thicker golden brown, using the same paint mixes as before, to paint in the bigger patches of this colour. I left little gaps through to the lighter colour underneath and could quickly see that this was actually too light. So I watered down the mix a little and used my bigger brush to darken bigger areas of fur so that the values look better. I applied everywhere that was the tone of this mix or darker, so that included working over the top of the darker areas I'd painted before. Because the paint was dry, the brush strokes I'd applied before could still be seen through this layer, and I held off from applying this into any areas I thought might be lighter. And I altered the colour of the mix to match what I could see. Then, when that was dry, I switched to a smaller brush again to add more fur detail. Painting fur realistically takes time, but it can be so blissful to get into the flow state and work on it. Then I switched back to darken up the broader patches of colour some more with the bigger brush. So much of the process is about switching from viewing the picture as a whole and looking for the bigger shapes of colour as I'm doing now, and then switching again to the smaller brush to add finer detail. If you work with fairly watery paint but onto dry paper, you can keep the detail but also keep the fur looking unified with the glazes from the bigger brush. The tonal juggling was well underway now, as I could see that I needed to darken the darker parts of fur some more, and I did that now, adding more furry line detail as I went. Notice how around the muzzle I'm making shorter lines and ensuring that they're pointing in the right directions. If you're thinking that this is a lot of work, you're right, but it's also meditative and relaxing too, and you can get really fast at it. After zooming in, I stand back to zoom back out to take in the whole and use the bigger brush and a fairly watery mix to darken broader areas again, adjusting my colours as I went. Then, as that dried, I went back in to adding more detailed line strokes with a small brush around the eyes and then the nose. Then I zoomed back out to glaze over the markings again to darken the dog and making it look a little bit less textured and a bit more unified. With the fur feeling pretty much dark enough overall, I went down to a smaller brush and continued to add more detail. Again, it's so fun to get in the flow and spend some time on this. Then I darkened the eyes a touch to bring them back in balance tonally. Finally, I felt able to remove the masking fluid from the whiskers and then use a small brush to paint a pale layer of paint over them and neaten them a little bit so that they didn't stand out too much. Then I made a few finishing touches by checking for any details I needed to add or any areas that needed darkening, and the realistic spaniel was finished. A full-length video class of this pet portrait is available now with Nature Studio membership. If you've enjoyed this mini class, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, then pop over to naturestudio.com where you can sign up for free classes and find loads of free resources to help you capture the beauty of your furry friends on your paper. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Yes. Beautiful. Just hold it still. You're being really patient. Just give me one more minute. Excellent.